Arun Gupta. I'm the Vice President and General Manager for Open Ecosystem at Intel. You can find all about us at open.intel.com. And we have a stellar podcast as well at open.intel.com/podcast. If you want to be a guest on that podcast, just reach out at open.intel.com. Happy Friday, first of all. I know it's exciting. It's a long weekend here in the United States, with Monday being the President's Day weekend. And so, on that note, I'm very happy to have Mike Lieberman and Ryan on the show. Hi, folks.
Hey,
All right. So, maybe you want to introduce yourself to begin with?
go ahead, Mike.
Sure. So I'm Mike Lieberman. I'm a co-founder and CTO of Kusari, a software supply chain security company. I've been heavily involved in open source security space for the past sort of several years, with a background in both sort of software development as well as sort of like what they refer to as DevSecOps. And in the open source space, I've done a lot of work with the CNCF, being a tag security lead over there. I'm also do a lot of work within the OpenSSF, being on the technical advisory council, a recently elected governing board member, as well as also a member of the SALSA steering committee, and I'm also a maintainer of a co-creator and maintainer of GUAC, which is currently an incubating project under the OpenSSF.
Wow, that's a lot of terms. We've got to peel those terms in the talk today. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I'm Ryan Ware. I have worked at Intel for the most part for the last 25 years. Actually, I was just thinking this morning, started June of 1999. So I'm old. Anyway, I have spent my entire career kind of working at the intersection of open source software and security in a variety of different ways. These days, I have the privilege of working for Arun. I am the security tooling working group lead in the OpenSSF and the governing board alternate, and working very actively trying to make sure Intel is using a variety of OpenSSF technologies like Scorecard and SALSA to make sure that we're creating as secure software as possible at Intel. So. Arun? Arun?
That's beautiful, actually. Yeah. No, the open source security sandwich, that's what we're going to talk about. But before we dig into that, Mike, you talked about software supply chain security, and we have had episodes on this LinkedIn hallway conversations, as we say, about software supply chain security. Why is it important? What is the relevance? Why does it matter?
Yeah, so I think when we, software supply chain security really is about how do you secure the production and consumption of software, and also in a recursive sort of way. It's often referred to as the bottom turtle problem, right? Where my software, let's just assume I'm running some Kubernetes, some sort of like software that runs in a container that runs on Kubernetes. Hey, I rely on both dependencies, like library dependencies and those sorts of things, and I also rely on Kubernetes. And Kubernetes relies on stuff that's happening in the OS. And the OS, has its own dependencies, and the OS itself relies potentially on the VM, right? And so on and so forth, all the way down to the hardware. And, at any point in time, one of those things, like one of those layers could be compromised. And then everything else, just by its nature, is potentially compromised. And so when we think about supply chain security, we're not just thinking about literally the software we're writing. It's about understanding the relationships you have with the software that you also rely on. So, once again, like this is the sort of like the log for shell thing, right? When that happened a little over 2 years ago, the worry was not necessarily that, I'm working on, nobody uses Log4j just in and of itself. It's, hey, I rely on Log4j for my logging, or maybe I rely on a framework that relies on Log4j somewhere. And so you're not exactly sure where that Log4j might live because it's not necessarily something that you're using directly. And so it could be often hard to figure out.
Yeah, so I think inadvertently you rely upon the software supply chain. So the security of it is really what is critical to you. Ryan, how does Intel think about software supply chain security, and what do we do around that?
So that's a really good question. Intel has a number of processes that we've been focusing on and putting in place to help make sure that our software supply chain is as secure as we can make it. This goes all the way back to when SolarWinds was um, made known to everybody, and what that particular vulnerability meant for that company. It's not like people hadn't considered that type of attack before. It's just nobody had operationalized something like that, and then suddenly SolarWinds comes along, and all of a sudden, oh hey, look, somebody actually did take a piece of malicious software and insert it into the build system of a company, so that transparently, this attacker was able to go ahead and inject malicious software into all of the software built by this platform. And so, Intel has a number of ways that we are focusing on making sure our software supply chain is secure. We actually have a wonderful team in Dave Flory's organization, who's focused on one CI for the entire company, and making sure that all of our CI solutions are as impervious to this as possible. And again, we're focused on OpenSSF and the technologies that OpenSSF is working on, and so we're working very closely with them and bringing in things like Salsa to help make sure Intel's CI solution is even more resilient against these types of attacks.
That makes sense. Mike, the talk today, I saw your original talk, the open source security sandwich, back in the OpenSSF Day, Tokyo, and I really enjoyed that talk. What's the analogy here? What's the sandwich look like? So walk us through that, peel that different bun, the patty, the lettuce, the onion, the tomato. Walk us through all those layers.
Sure, yeah. So let me actually share, I don't have many slides. I'm not very much a slide person here, but let me share something here that I think is probably worthwhile to kind of talk over first. So I think really, and most of these slides came, from some of that talk in Tokyo, but when we kind of are looking at what the sandwich is in the first place, right? We're thinking about, you're trying to secure producing and consuming software, as well as in the middle there, the distribution and storage of the software as well, so that you're doing it securely, right? Because at the end of the day, right, if nobody was running any software, there wouldn't be anything to secure. And so when folks kind of come to this problem, right, these are end users that are coming in, and there's, it could be a very, very large company like an Intel, a Microsoft, a Google, saying, hey, look, we use a lot of open source software and we need to really make sure that it gets de-risked. And then it could also be smaller folks who are trying to understand what their security risk is by just sort of pulling in a random library from the internet. And today it can be often very difficult to know what you're actually pulling in. And it can be difficult to know that. And then separately, as a producer of software, it can be very difficult to know who is using your software and in what, and how, and what their expectations are of your software. And I think it's worthwhile to highlight a little bit, especially in the open source space, that, open source maintainers, especially those who are not working within the environment, within a foundation, or working for an organization like an Intel, like a Google, like a Kusari, where, hey, we're involved in open source as part of the commercial aspect as well. You have a lot of maintainers that are just, we call them often weekend warriors. Like these are folks who after hours, they're working on a library. This is not their core job and they don't really owe anybody anything. So when a company says, hey, you have a vulnerability in your software, and they're like, well, I'm not really making it for you. I'm not making it for your commercial, consumption. So really, I think it's a lot of that sort of understanding that relationship and really putting the burden back on let's say the consumer to understand, hey, what are you looking for out of this? And so in order to do that, in order to make that easier, I think the first real big piece is to talk about some of the principles. And really the principles here are about open data formats and practices. For too long, security has been sort of this like gating function, right? It's been purely this thing that happens at the end. It's often been very secretive. There's a lot of interesting talks that have come out that have said something along the lines. I think this was a statistic that came from IBM that said something like 2/3 of security teams traditionally have not revealed metrics or data about how they sort of operate and what they're doing. And that's because the risk, the worry is, well, if I tell you how many vulnerabilities are in my organization, then you could potentially compromise it or something like that. Like, so even if I tell you, tell other teams within an organization. And so when we think about, this sandwich, we have to think about, hey, approaching it from an open data, open specification way, because too many of these things have been super secretive. Too many of the SCA tools that you might see are using, traditionally have used proprietary formats. They export a report in HTML and say, hey, we expect somebody to read through that report and then make an action, as opposed to it having something that could be interacted in a good way. So really open data formats and practices and all that sort of stuff. And so what do I mean by that? Really, hey, as opposed to in the past, you would have these proprietary SCA reports. They'd be either in a proprietary binary format, a proprietary XML format, or whatever. Now we have SBOMs. Like, use SBOMs. Now, SBOMs are often they're maligned in a lot of ways. But in addition to that, I think that they're overhyped in a lot of ways by a lot of folks as well. Whereas for the most part, they're just an open specification for communicating the dependencies on software. Really, that's the primary sort of purpose, along with, all the other things that are kind of come out of that, like licensing and all that sort of stuff. And then also, when you look at the build, for the most part, if you're using GitHub Actions, or if you're using Jenkins, or if you're using any of these various build tools, they're generating the output in lots of different ways, and most of the ways are just unstructured build logs. Well, we need to have this way of being able to say, how did something get built? And so that when I consume, if I'm using some open source software, I can pull that in and pull in this metadata in a structured way, so I know how something was built. Great. Structure it like salsa. The same thing goes with things like VEX, which is the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, right? Whereas and lots of other things as well, like proprietary health metrics like Scorecard. And I'll kind of move on real quickly. Go ahead.
If I take a pause here, what you're saying is you're trying to make a sandwich here. You want to put a bun, and on the bun you want to put like a mayo, you want to put a lettuce, you want to put a tomato, you want to put a patty. You want to make sure they're all aligned with each other. There's an order in which they need to go, and they need to be able to talk the same language so that it's interchangeable, as opposed to I'm going to put a bun and put another bun and then put a lettuce and then put a patty on top of that. It doesn't make sense in that order.
100%, right? And a lot of this is, I think, about, you're not putting, specialty ingredients that it can be like, hey, this thing does not go well with all these other ingredients that other people are building, that other people are making. And so when I talk about open specifications, it's really about, hey, making sure that all these things work together, right? Because if you have something that is proprietary and then you have another thing that's proprietary and they don't communicate well, the only recourse you have is going to that, those vendors and saying, hey, can you make them work together? Whereas when you look at sort of what the Linux Foundation is doing more broadly, but also specifically the OpenSSF and also obviously the broader open source community, when we look at these open specifications, open standards, open frameworks that are coming out, it's very easy to like a GitHub issue to say, hey, I noticed that, this element of the SBOM was missing. This, this thing in the scorecard, doesn't seem to work well with this other thing in Salsa. Oh, cool. We can, have that. We can go and attend community meetings. We can work through that and build those better things that can then be consumed again.
Got it.
And so,
yeah. And as a runner, my analogy would be, think of this as a relay. If you're not passing the baton to the next person, you're going to drop the baton. Because I don't know what language you're talking about. We are running past each other. Yes, we are all doing our own laps. But if you're not passing the baton, we cannot go fast.
Yep. 100%. And so, what does the sandwich sort of look like when we look at it in a diagram? And I think the thing here is, and I'll kind of, go through it step by step, but one layer of the bread really is about the software producer, right? On the top, you are talking about things like, as a producer, I should be producing Salsa. I should be producing OpenVex statements. I should be producing Scorecard. I should be using Scorecard and producing results from Scorecard and sharing that with my downstream consumers, especially if I'm an open source maintainer here. I should be using things like Allstar to help, enforce some of the security rules against my repo. And I should be using things like OpenSSF Security Insights, which is sort of a YAML file that describes what the outputs of your, what are the security outputs of your project? Where do the SBOMs live for your project? Are you using SAST? And if so, where might that SAST be running? Those sorts of things. And then you need to make sure that all of that great data ends up somewhere that is secure and can be stored somewhere. So some of this can be, and we're working in the OpenSSF with the great folks who are, running NPM, who are running PyPI and so on, like Ruby Gems, all that sort of stuff, to say, hey, we'd love to store some of this information in places. But in addition to that, OpenSSF, and there's a bunch of other open things as well. There is OSV, for example, which is the schema itself is owned by the OpenSSF, though the OSV public service is run by Google. But I think hey, there's all of this great data that can now flow into places like OSV, deps.dev, and then other tools that are coming out of OpenSSF like GUAC, which allows for the ingestion of all this great data and the analysis of it. So that folks who are downstream can better understand the supply chain risk, right? And then that kind of then flows into the downstream consumer tools, like your Salsa verifiers, like S2C2F, which is a framework that comes out of OpenSSF that's focused on securing open source consumption, right? And then you have the various API tooling for all the things that we've talked about before. And so now, hey, as a consumer, I don't care about Salsa, really. I don't care about Scorecard. I just care, is this secure? If I look up Salsa, what is that telling me? Oh, if I see that there's a Salsa attestation and it's a Salsa attestation I trust, then I know what it's telling me is that the provenance of this software, is secure. And then on the left-hand side are some additional pieces, which this is kind of where we're seeing the future kind of going with this is, for folks who are not familiar with Intoto and TUF, those are things that come out of CNCF. And they're pretty much a way of sort of, if you imagine everything I showed on the right, where you're talking about secure production, secure storage and distribution, and then secure consumption, the stuff on the left-hand side is the rules, A sandwich must consist of this sort of bread, must consist of this sort of, lettuce, meat, whatever, these sorts of veggies. And then at the bottom, you have this sort of bread on the bottom that it must have, right? So it's essentially setting up those set of rules.
So Ryan, when you look at this kind of a sandwich, what do you make out of it? At Intel, as we are looking at sort of the software supply chain security and always looking to improve sort of the security of our inbound and outbound projects, what do you make sense out of this sandwich?
So, I mean, I really like the diagram here that we have for the sandwich. There's a lot of different aspects of security that this helps clarify to non-security experts when they're looking at something like this. The thing that, Intel's doing a lot of different things, and I don't need to go into some of them, but one of the questions that this brings up for me that I'd love to hear from you, Mike, on is, one of the problems that we have is, doing salsa doesn't come for free. Doing a scorecard doesn't come for free. Doing GUAC takes effort, and development teams have to go put time into these things. And, I actually had a conversation this morning. Somebody was asking, why do we need to go do salsa for this? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because yes, we have answers that we're working on with teams internally, but this is a very broad problem. It's ecosystem wide, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, you bring up, I think, probably I would say the biggest challenge in all of this is not the tech, right? It's right. If you ask a developer today, right, work on security, right? Or actually, if you ask a developer, do you care about security? Very few developers are going to say no, right? Most developers are going to say, of course, I care about security. Now, if you tell them, do you care about salsa? Do you care about SBOMs? They're going to say, no, I don't care about SBOMs. I don't care about salsa. They're all ends to a means, right? Like it's I want to keep this thing secure. But if one of the things that I think is a problem here with some of the bits of the sandwich is a lot of times you're asking you're asking the software producer here, like if the top level stuff here is all bread, right? You're telling them, hey, get the flour, go in and put some water in, bake the bread yourself, like figure it all out. And a lot of maintainers are like, I have a lot of other things on my plate, right? Especially every year that goes by, it seems like developers are being asked to do more and more and more, right? They're being asked to become front end. Like if they're a back end developer, they're being asked to do front end. They're being asked to become database, experts. They're being asked to do all these things. And then you layer security on top. They need something like an easy button. They want to see the so what, right? And I think this one is a big one, because I just got a couple of questions a few days ago about, hey, I can understand why as a security engineer you want to see an SBOM, but I do not know why any developer would want to generate an SBOM. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I can see why they don't see that, right? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I totally get that. At the same time, part of me just cringes at the idea of a development team not wanting to know all of the software that comprises what they're building. And I don't know, I don't get that thought process.
So I think the thing there is a lot of folks are looking at this from the standpoint of, I already have the tools, right? I can run an SCA scan and get a report, right? I can go and run like various other tools to kind of get some of that information. I could look at my go.sum file if I'm using Golang, or I can look at a package.lock file and see that here's all the stuff. Now, once again, that's not everything. And often a lot of things gets lost there, but they're not looking at it like there's like, oh, but now you're telling me to switch things up. Now, I think the thing that needs to kind of come out of this is, hey, here's how you would use SBOMs to make your life easier, right? And I think there's a lot of ways that folks can do that, right? One thing is, hey, SCA's tools should start generating SBOMs, right? Like they should be working with SBOMs as opposed to be generating like proprietary reports on all these things, right? Because then now you have an SBOM. That SBOM is now portable. Now, when somebody asks you, what's your software consist of? And once again, I've worked in banks and I know I've seen this sort of thing before, where a lot of times you end up taking your requirements.txt, your Maven POM, and copying, pasting stuff into a spreadsheet. Great. Now I have an SBOM I can send, right? That sort of thing I think is important. And in addition to that, I think the things, to kind of go back to the salsa piece for a second, people want to see, what does salsa prevent, right? Can you, and this is something that I think worked really well. A few years ago, I had given a presentation on this at, I think it was the first supply chain security con that was co-located at KubeCon. I think it was 2021. And one of the things that resonated really well was, this was Salsa 0.1, but myself and one of my co-founders, Tim, we showed off like a fake compiler and showing off, like, if you're not using Salsa, this is it. Like, this fake compiler would never get caught. Oh, you're using Salsa with, the right sorts of things in place, and you're doing all these things. Great, it gets caught. Right. This is what and now you show that to a developer and they understand, right? They understand, like, oh, this is the actual impact. This is not just like another thing you're asking for me. And when I ask you, what does that mean? How does that help me? And you say, don't you care about security? And it's like that sort of thing is I think one of the biggest issues is, like, how do you show the producers who are doing a lot of this effort that, hey, this works? And then that also helps consumers understand that, yes, oh, if I consume this salsa attestation, I know it's more or less protecting against this sort of attack. It's detecting this sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I think teams want to really understand all of the software they're using to build the software that they're generating, and I actually, it's not even just a security problem necessarily. Like, I had a team that I was on, and they were having a problem for a few days trying to figure out a bug in their software, and they didn't quite realize that the compiler they thought they were building their software with wasn't actually the one they were building with. It was a different compiler that was installed in the system. So,
it's funny how security works. It is not important until it is, and then it consumes all your cycles. And it's also funny that how sometimes the fear that, like Mike, as you were talking about, that, hey, let me show you this compiler, why attestation is required in terms of what you are building. Like, sometimes you have to go sort of the reverse philosophy, reverse psychology here, that if you don't do this, these bad things will happen to you. And somehow that's sort of the psychology works. What can be done to potentially leverage this high-level sandwich approach that you're talking about, to maybe take a more positive approach? That, what could we do as an industry, essentially? What do you think can be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things is I think painting the end-to-end picture. One of the first things I think is showing some examples, right? I think folks want to see examples of stuff because, and we've seen this before, where a lot of folks, had argued against requiring MFA on certain package managers. And then, even just when some of that was being asked of folks, a few weeks later, it turned out those same folks who were complaining about it had been attacked and had their credentials stolen. And I think, we don't want to obviously get to that point, but I think showing examples to folks of, hey, this stuff is happening. This is what it looks like. And right, like when I think the big thing, and this is, some stuff that we had heard from some end users at DevOps days in New York City during the summer, when they looked at stuff like GUAC, right? And GUAC was ingesting all these SBOMs, ingesting all these salsa attestations, and we were, demoing it. They said, oh, wow, we would have loved to have something like this during Log4Shell, because our biggest worry was, where does this exist in my ecosystem, right? Where, hey, I'm now staying up super late running scans across every single server, every single container, every single, jar file, whatever I have, Ware, whatever. What can we do to kind of increase the amount of information I have access to? And then kind of continue, like, foster that feedback loop, right? One of the, I think, big challenges that OpenSSF faces a little bit is, like, we need to pull in more end users who are like, no, I want to know, hey, is this thing that I'm purchasing going to blow up in my face, right? Like, is this thing, not even just purchasing, I should say, is this open source software I'm about to pull in going to blow up in my face? Like, another good example is, we worked with an early user of GUAC who discovered that, hey, one of the tools that we use for, I think it was like highlighting on the terminal, like it just added colors to the terminal, they realize like it's written and maintained by one person and has very, very broad access to everything that's kind of going on there. And they're like, we had no idea that this thing was happening. And I think you don't want to fear monger, but you want to show folks like, hey, there is risk, but also show that it's easy to mitigate that risk, right? And the same reason, like I have a lock on the door to my, the front of my house. I use an alarm system. I only know that it's working because, as far as I can tell, nobody's broken in. But with that said, these things are tested. They go through certifications, and I think the same sort of thing needs to happen in open source a little bit, where you could show that, yep, we've tested it against these sorts of attacks, and we can show that these sorts of things like Salsa, Scorecard, etc., are mitigating these sorts of things.
That's wonderful, actually. Let's go back to the sandwich for a second again. Help us break it down that as a producer, as a consumer, what we should be looking at, what are the things we need to pay attention to? Well, all of us kind of live in the OpenSSF land, so we understand Salsa, GUAC,
Yep.
all of these technology very well. But how do we piece this together? Like, I have a GitHub repo. Should I be looking at Salsa? Should I be looking at GUAC? What should my operational model be for this sandwich from a producer side and a consumer side?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things that are going on. I think to start off with, and this is where I think the OpenSSF and the community needs to do a bit of a better job is kind of breaking it down. And we have a project in the OpenSSF called the Security Tool Belt, where we're trying to say, hey, let's take all these various tools like Salsa, like Vex, like Scorecard, and build a tool belt out of it. But I mean, tool belt is maybe not the greatest term here, but it's a way of placing everything together in a way where they all work together and say, we need to do a secure build. Great, Salsa fits in. We need to have a way of explaining exceptions. Great, OpenVex fits in. We need to have a way of showing the health of a project based on its repo permissions and all that great stuff. Scorecard. We need to have a way of enforcing it. Allstar, right? I think all those things are super important. But what I think to the end user consumer, what we want to hear is just like, what is the thing you're looking for? Like, oh, we want to know that this is like didn't get, like this was actually built by the maintainers of the project and that their build was not, compromised. Oh, okay, cool. Like the consumers don't care so much about the specifics. Like now security engineering teams in big enough organizations, they're going to scrutinize each of these things. But your average sort of smaller company that isn't focused on security is going to say, hey, look, if somebody could just tell me, like, give me a thumbs up that yes, that open source project is good, or a thumbs down that the open source project isn't good, given my risk profile, right? I want to know those things. So when we look at the sandwich, I think a lot of it comes down to pulling in more of those consumers to figure out what they're actually looking for, right? What are they really to get out of it? And then from the producer side is how do you also continue to make that easy, right? And I think the making it easy standpoint is the important piece, right? Because no one cares, very few people care about the individual pieces of the sandwich. They care about the sandwich as a whole.
I think that's really the key here. That it needs to be a holistic approach where everybody want to do security as long as they don't have to do any additional work for that. I think that's how usually developers look at it. So what are the tools so in terms of the operational model, what should developers look at? Like, how should they, like, I have a repo and let's say I'm committed to make it more secure over next 6 months. How do you think that they should look at this sandwich and start implementing some of the practices?
Yeah, I think so there's still a lot of work to be done to make it simpler, but assuming you have the capacity right now, I think the first steps are to kind of go through. Actually, there's a good tool called CLO Monitor or CLO Monitor that comes out of CNCF that looks at a lot of this stuff. And they are doing a lot of really great stuff in that space. And that part of that kind of extends into a thing called Security Slam that Eddie Knight from Sonatype helps run. And what I think is really great there is they sort of gamified this piece But I think the thing that folks have noticed, actually, and which I think is important and should be shouted to the hills here, is like some of these simple things, like just turning on Scorecard and implement, like turning on Salsa, is actually a lot simpler than you think. Now, there still is a lot of paper cuts here and there, where a lot of rough edges where you turn on Scorecard and the first thing it tells you is like, oh, you got to fix this. And then you fix that. And then that triggers the next thing that you're like, oh, I just fixed that and it triggered a new thing. And that sort of thing, especially if you're not a security engineer or if you're not super focused on it, even though it might only take a few hours to fix or a few days to fix a lot of these things, it's getting constantly poked and prodded by each of these like little things. You're like, oh, it's annoying. That sort of stuff. I think, if you can deal with it, it goes away after a few days and then everything's a lot easier. But I think the thing that we've seen is Eddie from Sonatype has this. I think it comes from the Sonatype supply chain security report that actually shows that folks who are doing things like Scorecard, doing these practices that are part of that sandwich, their security posture is high. Like you can actually show that the number of overall vulnerabilities goes down. The number of I think it's like the mean time to remediating a disclosed vulnerability to them goes down, right? Because if you're doing these security things, these security hygiene things, it just becomes easier and easier.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you bring that up because I think of it as a security hygiene debt or security technical debt. You turn on these things and suddenly people become aware of the problems. I mean, like we started scanning Intel's repos with Scorecard, and oh hey, look, there happen to be these repos here who are subject to script injection through PRs, right? It's like, oh, the developers had no idea. They didn't realize this, but now they do. And it's funny because, the longer they take to fix these things before they know about them, the more they're going to have to do once you start turning on these tools. So it's an interesting problem that we got to figure out and how to make it easier for folks. That said, one of the things you brought up a little while ago, you had found a project that was using a open source library that was only maintained by one person. And I can't tell you the number of times where I run into a software project and here like 15 levels down, there's this one in the dependency tree, there's this one particular open source project that only has one maintainer and it hasn't been updated in 3 years. And how from my understanding of the statistics, over half of open source repos only have one or maybe two maintainers. How do we focus the security sandwich to those folks? Because it's the majority of repos out there, and we want to be able to make sure we can use that software, but at the same time, if there's just one maintainer, it's a little bit problematic.
And particularly, Ryan, in those cases, this is their hobby. This is not
Yep.
their full-time
Absolutely.
job. So how do you like OpenSSF charter is to improve the security posture of open source. So, and it's a wonderful thought process in terms of the sandwich. But if you have a team dedicated to an effort, then maybe you can make progress. And even there, we have seen inertia. To Ryan's point, if majority of the repos are like and they're single person doing it in their spare time, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, I think it depends, right? So I think the first step, the first piece of it is like you don't want to put the burden on the maintainer. You also can't force the maintainer to do anything if they don't want to. So I think the first step is just like, hey, does the maintainer want to do better here, right? Because once again, it could be, hey, this is just a thing I'm working on the weekend, and if nobody used my project, I'd be okay with it. Like I'm just making it for myself, right? So I think if you make it easy, some maintainers are going to come along. Some maintainers are still going to say, hey, I don't have the capacity. And then I think it really depends on what the consumers are looking for. And that's where there's like these great projects like S2C2F, the frameworks like S2C2F that are saying, hey, look, for cases like that, you might want to fork the project. You might want to clone the project, because also how important is it to you, right? If it's important enough that you're like, I can't live without this single maintainer project, is it something that your organization wants to sponsor? Is it something that your organization wants to fork? There's also, definitely ample opportunity for companies to go out there and, and we see this already where there's a lot of projects that are out there that saying, hey, look, we will take on the burden of maintaining the security of these various projects in the open source space. So I think there is that give and take. With that said, I think there's a lot of ample opportunity for groups like the OpenSSF to foster more of this thing where, hey, in cases where there are these maybe smaller projects that are not critical enough that somebody's going to say, yeah, I'm going to spend X amount of dollars to fork it and maintain it myself. But hey, we throw a maintainer some reasonable money, or we throw them even somebody to maintain the security piece of that, or hey, we'll throw an extra maintainer to your project if you'd be open to it, right? I think a lot of opportunity for that as well. But I think the burden really is on the consumer. And I think that what the consumer also wants to know is they want to have that information, right? Because a lot of times they might say, oh, actually, I don't need that, right? And I can get rid of that library. But in the cases where they can't, the consumer needs to make that trade-off of like, well, is this something? There's lots of opportunities. I can fork it. I can pay another company to manage it for me. I can potentially reach out to the maintainer myself and say, hey, this is maybe something we want to be involved in. But I don't think you can put the burden too much on the maintainer.
No, I agree. I don't think, you can't force the maintainer to do something they don't want to do. And if they don't want their software to be, ready to be used by others, by corporations, there's no reason that they need to go do that. I think it's just for consumers, making it visible, the status, the security status of that software stack, I think is important.
Yeah, it's very critical that we streamline that process so that, as they're doing a build, it's just one more command or maybe part of the build itself, where security is pervasive, but there is something that is not something that they're working towards. I think on those lines, Mike, one of the things that you showed at the OpenSSF Day Tokyo was Scooter. So I understand the concept that if you have a repo, long-running repo, lots of maintainers, single maintainer, whatever it is, you have to apply over there. I'm starting brand new. I'm starting ground up. What can I do to make sure that the sandwich is part of my recipe, so that the salsa, the guac, and the scorecard, and the SBOM, and the VEX, and the whole deal, I get, I bootstrapped in that infrastructure. So that's one. And the second part of it is, how much of an overhead does that add to my build cycles? I think those are the two questions that I would be interested to learn about.
So I think to first answer a little bit of like, hey, is something like if for a new project, I think it's always going to be easier, right? And that's one of the reasons why I built out scooters, and I can show even a little demo in a little bit if folks are interested. But I think one of the biggest issues there, right, is retrofitting an existing project is always going to be much harder. And so when it comes to a lot of this stuff, some of it's just showing how easy it could be if you kind of put all the pieces together. And I think one of the things the security community can do is actually like, hey, let's all work together to see where are the rough edges in all the things we're doing. Because, hey, in creating scooters, definitely discovered a few rough edges in how Scorecard works, and discovered a few rough edges in how SBOMs get generated and how salsa, blah, blah, blah. And oh, wow, these are things we can now bring back to these communities to make it easier and kind of bring folks back in as well.
That's wonderful. Mark Atwood. Hey, Mark, he is our open source expert from Amazon. He says, I think most projects would not say no to help as long as it doesn't start as a complete change to everything about their process. And that's what sort of the philosophy that we have been talking about.
Yep, 100% there. I think when it comes to, like, I think most folks were not going to turn down help. I think that they're also going to come in and say stuff like, "Hey, I also don't want to, um, like, be forced to now maintain a bunch of stuff." So the simpler you can make it, like, and the simpler you can make it, the simpler you can, make the onboarding process, the more you can walk folks through it, the more you can show them how important it is. Each of these things really helps here. The problem, of course, is always like, yeah, if it's super easy to set up and then every day they're spending 2 hours maintaining it, nobody's going to want to do it. Yeah.
So, have you thought about how could we use AI potentially here, to create minions that can, potentially scan through these GitHub repos and say, I'm going to issue pull requests, leveraging AI somehow, to scale this, to maybe be more productive.
I think it depends. I think that there is a future there. The worry, of course, is when AI gets it wrong, it can be very like confusing, and you're like, wow, I approved a PR and now I have to deal with it because AI, it was wrong. Because we're even seeing it today with some of the Dependabot stuff where,
Right.
oh my gosh, every day Dependabot's asking me 2 or 3 new things, and I don't know, like, should I keep just putting it in? And what happens if it somehow, like, oh, that new version wasn't, even though it wasn't supposed to be, even though it was supposed to be backwards compatible, it had some bug and now everything is broken, and now I've broken my project, and that's the reason why I don't like that bot. I think that there's always going to be a little bit of a balance there. I think AI is definitely going to be helping. I think AI can also do a lot of great, like, I think AI in suggesting areas is going to be much better than necessarily just purely making the PR. I don't want to go too far too early because we've already seen in a couple of places where a few folks turned on some AI bots to start opening up PRs, and all of a sudden maintainers like, why do I have 1,000 PRs against my repo? And so I think, yeah, we don't want to go too hard too fast.
For sure. You don't want to increase the volume for the sake of volume, and that's sort of the risk over there, particularly with, say, the automated code generators, for example. The volume could increase, the quantity can increase, is the quality increasing as well? Sort of that, as they say, the beef to bun ratio, how does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest problems with AI is we need the right training data so that AI can make accurate, not necessarily 100%, because I don't think anything's ever going to be 100%, but it's got to be better than the false positive rate of the tools we have now, and it's just not there. I think eventually we will get there, but and all hail that day for coming, because I want perfect answers from these tools. I think the other thing with these tools that we need to make sure of is that they are not intrusive to the developers, but giving the right information to the developer at the right time. Like, static code analysis, make sure that the developer gets that information at pull request time. They don't need it 2 weeks after the pull request has been accepted. So I think that same model has to go with all of these tools we put in place.
Yeah.
Oh, go.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, one of the key things that we, one of the key principles of GUAC is, like, get the information in the hands of the people in the form they need it, in the way they need it, when they need it, which I think is super important. So, like, hey, a developer who, let's say, is doing something like at PR time or in their IDE, give them the little red squiggle that says, hey, look, you're using, did you know that you're using a potentially a typo squatted dependency? Double check, stuff like that. Like, and get it in the hands of the folks when they need it. Because if you tell a developer, oh yeah, now you need to go to this other security tool and start going through their dashboard and doing that sort of stuff, so many developers are going to, like, yeah, like, that might work for a security engineer and a security engineering team, but the average developer is like, you're taking me out of my IDE, out of GitHub, or out of my other Git repo, GitLab, whatever, and now you're saying I need to use some other tool. Like,
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Mark, again, thank you for the comment that nagging and hectoring maintainers won't work. No, and this goes back to the point that you were making, Mike, earlier. Open source developers don't own a thing to anybody. They're doing their thing on the side as a hobby, and they're already doing a social cause. So badges, whatever, it won't work. Just how do we simplify the task for them so that security becomes inherent in their, while they're busy building the thing, if they are not focused on security, there needs to be an effort around them to support them to be more secure.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back once again to just like if you could add the security into the tools they're already using, or if you create a new tool, you're replacing something. You're not like saying, hey, this is yet another thing, right?
Yeah.
So like that's one of the reasons to create sort of the project scooters was to also do that same sort of thing.
Let's take a look at Scooter then.
Sure. So before anybody asks too many questions, it is very, very, very early on. Like we're talking alpha, maybe pre-alpha here. So, but this is something that started off as a POC that I wrote a couple of hours before my talk in Tokyo, just to kind of show some stuff off, and kind of has evolved from there. So I'm gonna run. It's written in.
You gave the disclaimer of pre-alpha. I understand it, but I think, to me, when I saw the project over there, we are not done creating GitHub projects,
Yep.
and we're only going to create so many more GitHub projects. And to me, really, the power lies in it. If and let people look at it first, but the whole idea here is we are automatically baking into that security sandwich for you. And you started this as a fun project, but I'm really hoping more people get excited by this if they believe in security and start contributing to the project. So let's roll.
Sure. So it's written in Rust, and pretty much, like obviously all of these things could be configured and whatnot here, but I give it the name of a project. So I'll just, Scoot webinar 1. I can give it, this is a demo. I put it where I want it to. Right now it's only supporting Go. Maven's I'm still building out a bunch of stuff for Maven. And I'll just kind of very quickly kind of go over what it did. So it created the GitHub repo. It generated a CD event for folks who are aware of CD events. CD event is just a sort of a subset, or rather, it's a sub schema in cloud events for you to sort of say, hey, I created a repo or I created a CI project. It's a way of sort of decoupling events from the actual how you might call a thing that's part of your SDLC. So like creating a repo, running a test, those sorts of things, so that you can then have that all go on an event stream. But won't go too deep into that right this second. But it does some basic stuff. It clones it down. It initializes the Go module. It does some basic stuff like generates a README, generates the license file, generates a git ignore, generates security insights, all the things like a GitHub action and so on. And so if I go and now, and then after all that, it saves everything to, sorry, I should also say, it also does some stuff like enabling branch protection and vulnerability reporting inside of GitHub, and then it saves it all to a database so that you can then go back and potentially manage stuff after, pull information out of it for auditing. So for example, for S2C2F or similar, and there's going to be a bunch of features that I'm going to be adding as well on making sure that it like, hey, pull the SBOM that it generates, pull all these things out of it now, pull the salsa attestation and have access to that, and then also have it all forward to things like GUAC. But let me show you what this actually looks like now. Inside the repo.
Like when somebody's creating a new repo, this is not what they would do, but it's saying use Scooter to create that repo. It not only creates a repo, but it creates those plugin points for that open source sandwich, security sandwich that you're talking about, so that they're all in there.
Yep. And so by and large, it's like, hey, it creates like, a security insights file, and the security insights file is based on all the info that we have in here. It generates a basic right now security policy, plan to make that sort of customizable. Like, hey, we turned on GitHub's own internal reporting thing. Right now it generates a basic Apache license. Sets up stuff like Dependabot, sets up things like a GitHub releases workflow, a scorecard, CodeQL, and so on. So if we actually look at the security and we go to code scanning, you'll see, hey, it turned on scorecard and it got rid of all the normal alerts except for 4. And these are ones that can't be done except manually, right? I can't magically make a new maintainer for your project. So on that end, and also the maintained requirement requires the project to be older than 90 days. I can't magically make a maintainer to enable code review for you. Fuzzing requires resources for fuzzing, and there's no just like automated free resources yet around that. And then for the CII best practices badge, that is also manual. You have to request access to join best practices, the best practices badge. So, but everything else about SAS scans and all the other things are all sort of taken care of here, like stuff like pinning to hashes for everything, including your GitHub actions. All of that is taken care of by scooters. And even if I go to the GitHub actions, you'll see, it ran, CI fuzz didn't work because the, requires access to the actual fuzzing resources, but everything else here, like running Scorecard, running CodeQL, running the release pipeline, is all managed by scooters.
So, Mike, with scooters, one of the questions that I have from a purely selfish perspective, being the security tooling working group lead, is one of the things that we've talked about for a long time is making it very easy for developers to turn on all the right switches for their projects. Is Scooter something that you've considered bringing to OpenSSF as a tool into OpenSSF? Because this would be a great starting point for a lot of the things that we've talked about doing over the years.
Yeah, I think so. I think the first step, right, and this is part of OpenSSF's own requirements, is need to find more maintainers of the project. Right now, it's just me, and it's written in Rust, and I know not everybody knows Rust. I love Rust, but I know not everybody loves Rust. But on that end, if we can find more maintainers, definitely, interested in contributing this back to the OpenSSF in the future as well. And I think some other things that I think are in scooters that are potentially valuable to folks as well is like it already has a baked in REST API that you could just run. So if you wanted to run it as an external service, it can do that. If you wanted to, there's lots of things there to make it super easy and extensible for various things. Just need to find, I think, some more maintainers. And I think one of the things that we'd love to also get is more end users like, hey, have a couple, and this is something we're trying out with the security tool belt, is why don't we get a couple of both maintainers who are going to come in, put this thing through its paces and then say, hey, the output, hey, end users, is this what you're looking for from open source projects? Like, are these the documents? Are these the SBOMs? Are these the things you're looking for? Yes? No? Because then we can keep iterating on it and maybe, hey, scooters is maybe not the right fit. We want to do this. We want to do that or whatever. Like, I think that's where, very open. But if folks are interested in scooters, definitely interested in pulling more folks into it and, having some chats about the next steps with it.
I'll have to talk to figure out how my manager might respond to me helping contribute.
Yeah, that's fantastic, actually. And this is an area where we may want to contribute. And of course, you are deeply involved in the OpenSSF land, and let's figure out how we can get you more maintainers on this, because again, we're only going to create more and more repos going forward. And if we can start baking in the tools automatically, that really elevates the security posture. Mike, we're just a couple of minutes away from wrap up. You want to talk a little bit about Kusari, what that company is?
Sure, yeah. So Kusari, we're software supply chain security company, which also often now referred to a little bit as application security posture management as well. We are very involved in very focused company. We don't. And so for us, we're building a lot of tools and systems on top of things like scooters, on top of things like GUAC, as a way of helping folks better understand their software supply chain and help answer a lot of the really hard questions that something like a single SBOM can't handle, right? It's like, yep, you have one SBOM and you want to just see, does it have a vulnerability, blah, blah, blah. Hey, that's easy. But what happens when you have an ecosystem of thousands upon thousands of projects, and you want to know where's the bottlenecks, where are the core libraries that we're using across the board, how much might that cost, how long might that take to fix based on other analytics. So when those are the sorts of things we work on, and we're very interested in hearing from folks and working with people from an end user standpoint. And we plan to go live with the beta of our product probably a little later in the year.
Wonderful. Yeah, and when your product is ready, I would love to bring you back here so that hopefully people can learn more and get more excited about. I mean, I've known you for a couple of years now, but I've really seen you around for several years.
Yeah.
And the amount of work that you have done, the depth that you bring to open source security is just stunning, actually. So thank you so much for being part of the community around and chugging along.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That was very kind. I appreciate that a lot. For as much as all the business stuff, I also very much appreciate just being a good contributor in the community. And I'm super happy to be on, and I'm also very thankful to have great folks like yourselves, like Ryan and Arun here, to also be pushing really, really great initiatives and working on really great things in the open source community.
We're all in this together.
Thank you.
Let's do a group hug here. Like this, group hug. And we can all have a physical hug, hopefully at one of the SOS events this year.
Yes.
Awesome. Fantastic, folks. I really enjoyed it. A minute over, but hopefully people really enjoyed it. Once again, Arun Gupta signing off right now. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.